Welcome to another deep dive, and we're going to be talking about a really, really tough subject today.
Yeah, this one is going to be pretty heavy.
Yeah, we're looking at the family murders that took place in Adelaide, Australia in the late 70s and early 80s, and we're using an episode of Case File as our source material. It's Case 166, The Family.
Yeah, great episode.
It's a really tough listen.
It is, yeah. It covers some pretty brutal crimes.
Yeah, so if you're not up for that today, we completely understand. Go check out another one of our deep dives and come back to this one later.
Yeah, and just a warning, this one is a bit of a longer one as well.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here and a lot of different threads to follow.
Twists and turns.
It's a very disturbing case, and it really gets into some of the darkest aspects of human nature.
Definitely. And it also raises a lot of questions about the justice system and whether or not everyone involved in these crimes was actually held accountable.
Yeah, that's one of the most unsettling things about this case.
The mystery of it all.
Even though Bevan Spencer von Einem was convicted for one of the murders, the podcast episode, and a lot of the evidence suggests he wasn't alone.
Yeah, right from the beginning, you get this sense that there's something bigger going on, a network of people, maybe even a conspiracy of silence.
Exactly, and that's what makes this case so chilling.
There are all these whispers and rumors about a group known as the Family, supposedly powerful and influential people who might have been involved in some way.
And as we go through the details, it's hard not to wonder if there's any truth to those rumors.
We're going to try and sort through all of that today and hopefully shed some light on what really happened.
Okay, so before we get too deep into the weeds, let's set the scene a little bit.
Yeah, Adelaide, Australia, in the late 70s and early 80s, it was a time of a lot of social change, but also a time when this darkness was unfolding.
Right, so between 1979 and 1983, 5 young men disappeared.
5 young men, all around the same age, all vanished without a trace.
Their names are forever linked to this case. Alan Barnes, Neil Muir, Mark Langley, Peter Stognoff, and Richard Kelvin.
Each of their stories is tragic and heartbreaking.
And as we go through the details, we're going to see how their lives intersected and how their disappearances are all connected in some way.
It's like a puzzle with a lot of missing pieces.
So let's start with the first case, the one that really set everything in motion.
Alan Barnes.
Alan was just 16 years old.
He was last seen on a Sunday afternoon, June 17, 1979.
He was hitchhiking home, and a witness saw him get into a white Holden HQ sedan.
And that was the last anyone ever saw him alive.
His body was found 5 days later at the South Par Reservoir.
But it wasn't a peaceful scene.
He had been brutally beaten and sexually assaulted.
The details are really disturbing. I don't know if we need to go into all of them here.
Yeah, we'll spare you the most gruesome details, but suffice it to say the level of violence was extreme.
It seemed like whoever did this was filled with rage.
And it wasn't just the physical injuries. The autopsy also found chloral hydrate and alcohol in his system,
Which suggests he was drugged and incapacitated before the attack.
So right from the start, we're seeing signs of premeditation, a calculated and deliberate act.
Definitely. And it's that premeditation that really sets this case apart from a random act of violence.
It suggests that whoever killed Alan had planned it out, thought about it ahead of time.
And that's a really chilling thought.
It is, and it raises a lot of questions that did Alan know his attacker? Was he specifically targeted, or was this a more random act of violence?
Those are the questions that the police were grappling with right from the beginning.
And as we'll see, those questions become even more important as the investigation unfolds.
Yeah, because this is just the first piece of the puzzle.
And unfortunately, it's not the last.
A few months after Alan's murder, another young man disappeared. Neil Muir. He was 25 years old.
His case is even more disturbing in some ways because of the state his body was found in.
Yeah, Neil's body was found floating in Mutton Cove, and the level of mutilation was horrifying.
He had been dismembered with his limbs placed inside his chest cavity.
And what's particularly strange is that the killer had gone to great lengths to remove any identifying marks.
Like his fingerprints and tattoos.
Yeah, it's like they wanted to make it impossible to identify him, but then they left his face intact.
Which is so bizarre. Why go through all that trouble to make him unidentifiable and then leave the one part that could give him away?
It's almost like a signature, a way of taunting the police.
A calling card.
Exactly. And there were other similarities between Alan and Neil's cases, too.
Like the anal injuries.
Right, which suggested that there might be a link between the two murders.
So now the police are dealing with potentially connected cases, a possible pattern emerging.
The pressure is on to find the killer before anyone else disappears.
What direction did the investigation take at that point? Did they have any leads?
Initially, they focused on the drug scene.
Because Neil had been last seen leaving a methadone clinic.
Right, and there was a Dr. Peter Millhouse who was known to associate with Neil and had been previously investigated for illegal prescriptions.
Sounds like a good suspect.
They found some potential evidence too, like matching fibers at his house and witness statements placing him with Neil around the time of his disappearance.
It sounds like they were getting close, but something must have gone wrong.
Despite the circumstantial evidence, Millhouse was acquitted of the murder.
Oh, wow.
It was a major setback for the investigation and left the police with more questions than answers.
And I bet that acquittal must have been frustrating for the police, especially with the mounting fear in Adelaide.
Absolutely. The idea that a predator was on the loose had to be terrifying for people.
And those fears were further heightened by the disappearances of two more young men.
Peter Stognoff and Mark Langley.
Peter was just 14 years old when he vanished in August of 1981.
He disappeared after wagging school, and a few months later, a book about the serial killer John Wayne Gacy was found near his home, covered in blood.
That's a really chilling detail.
It is, and it adds another layer of creepiness to this whole story.
And then there's Mark Langley. He was 19 years old and vanished while hitchhiking after a party in June of 1982.
Both of their bodies were eventually found, and the similarities to the previous murders were undeniable.
It seems like with each new victim, the level of violence escalated.
Yeah, and there were other details that started to emerge that connected all of these cases together.
Like the presence of mandrax in some of the victim systems.
Right, and that's where the story takes a turn towards a very specific individual, Bevan Spencer von Einem.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork now, and we're finally getting to the man at the center of this case.
What can you tell us about Bevan Spencer von Einem? What kind of person was he?
Well, on the surface, he seemed like a regular guy, an accountant who lived with his mother. He even played the harp.
He didn't exactly fit the profile of a cold-blooded killer.
But as we'll see, beneath this ordinary facade lurked something truly sinister.
Hold on, everyone, because we're about to dive deep into the life and crimes of Bevan Spencer von Einem. Yeah, so that ordinary guy on the surface thing, oh, that really throw you off the scent, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. But you mentioned the mandrax thing. I mean, that wasn't the first time that von Einem came on the police's radar.
That's true. There was an incident with a teenager named George that happened before they even made the mandrax connection.
Yeah, what happened with that?
Well, it seems a 16-year-old boy was lured to this party only to be drugged and sexually assaulted.
Oh, God, that's awful. Was anyone ever held accountable for that?
2 transgender women who lived at the house identified von Einem as the man who brought George there. But when questioned, von Einem insisted everything was consensual. He even claimed he helped George shower and sent him home in a cab.
That story sounds so unbelievable. Like, who's going to believe that?
Exactly. It was full of inconsistencies, but at the time they didn't have enough evidence to charge him.
Oh, man, that's so frustrating. You can see the red flags, but you're tied by the need for hard proof.
Exactly, and this is a pattern we see time and time again in these cases.
Right. It's like they know they're dealing with a dangerous individual, but they're powerless to stop him.
Until they have that one crucial piece of evidence.
And in this case, that piece of evidence was the mandrax prescription.
Exactly. Detectives Kipling and O'Brien were going through prescription records, and they saw von Einem's name on a prescription for mandrax.
Oh, wow. What a break.
And they remembered him from the George incident.
So they realized this could be a major connection.
They went to his house and asked him to come to the station for questioning.
I'm guessing that von Einem, being the cautious type, wouldn't just go willingly.
Oh, you're right. He insisted on having his solicitor present.
Okay, so they finally get him down to the station for questioning. What happens next?
Well, he admitted to using mandrax for insomnia, but claimed he hadn't filled a prescription for over a year.
And what about the murders? Did he say anything about those?
He denied any involvement and even said something really strange. He said, "I think it would be unethical of me. I shy away from violence of any description."
Unethical? I mean, that's a weird way to describe murder, right?
It is. It's like he was trying to intellectualize something inherently monstrous.
It speaks to a certain psychological disconnect for sure.
A compartmentalization that you often see in individuals capable of such acts.
So they question him, but they still need more evidence, right?
Yeah. Von Einem agreed to let them search his house and car.
And what did they find?
They found various sedatives and hypnotics, including chloral hydrate, the same drug that was found in Alan Barnes' system.
That must have been a major discovery.
It was, but then something really unexpected happened.
What happened?
One of the detectives, O'Brien, was so obsessed with his case that he couldn't sleep. So he decided to drive by von Einim's house late that night just to see if anything was going on.
Okay.
And as he was passing by, he saw an unfamiliar car in the driveway and lights on inside.
It sounds like something out of a movie.
I know, right? So he waited and watched the house for hours, but the visitor didn't leave. Eventually, he had to call it a night.
Did he ever find out who the visitor was?
Oh, yeah. The next morning, they ran a check on the car's license plate, and it belonged to a prominent Adelaide businessman.
Really? Wow, a prominent businessman. This is getting more and more complicated.
Yeah, and it really started to raise questions about who else might be involved in this.
It makes you think that von Einem wasn't acting alone.
Exactly.
So what did the police do with this new information?
They raided the businessman's home and business, but they didn't find anything conclusive.
Oh, man, so close.
But they didn't give up. They put him under surveillance and started to notice some pretty suspicious behavior.
Like what?
Well, every day he would take an hour-long lunch break, and he would always drive the same route, which included stops at known gay cruising areas.
Sounds like he was searching for someone.
Yeah, and they had a gut feeling it wasn't for innocent reasons.
Right, but they still needed hard evidence.
That's when they got another anonymous phone call, this time from someone who became known as Mr. B.
Wait, didn't Mr. B call the police before?
You're right, he did call earlier in the investigation, but his information was dismissed.
Oh, okay, I remember now, but this time was different.
Yeah, this time he had much more detailed information about von Einem and his activities.
What kind of information did he give them?
He described meeting von Einem at a gay cruising spot and eventually becoming part of his inner circle.
Wow, this is huge.
And he described some truly disturbing things. He said they would pick up hitchhikers, drug them with sedatives, disguised as something else, and then things would take a very dark turn.
Oh, God, that's horrible.
He said he even helped carry an unconscious Alan Barnes into von Einem's bedroom.
No way.
And a few days later, von Einem allegedly told him that Alan had died.
Oh, my God.
So Mr. B's testimony was really starting to paint a very grim picture of von Einem's world.
And it provided a possible motive for the murders.
Exactly.
So with this new information, the police finally had enough to act.
They arrested von Einem for the murder of Richard Kelvin.
That was the most recent victim, right?
That's right. And they had a lot of evidence against him at this point, the matching fibers, the hair dye evidence. It was all starting to add up.
And of course, Mr. B's testimony was crucial.
Absolutely.
So how did von Einem respond to the arrest?
During the trial, he insisted he was innocent. He even tried to create an alibi, claiming he was comforting Richard over bullying issues.
Did anyone believe that?
The jury didn't. They found him guilty and sentenced him to life in prison.
Wow.
Yeah, it was the harshest sentence ever given in South Australia at that time.
It sounds like justice was finally served, at least for Richard Kelvin's murder. But what about the other victims? Did von Einem ever face charges for those deaths?
Well, the police were convinced he was responsible for more than just Richard's death. But they needed more than just Mr. B's testimony to prove it in court.
And there was still the question of those other people that Mr. B had mentioned.
Yeah, like who are those other individuals who might have been involved?
That's what makes this whole family thing so disturbing.
Right, that term really took on a sinister meaning in this case.
It suggested a conspiracy of silence, a group of influential people protecting one of their own.
And there were all these rumors and whispers about von Einem's life in prison, things that added fuel to those suspicions.
What kind of rumors?
Well, there were whispers that he received special treatment and things like that, that he had access to a prison officer's mobile phone.
Yeah, that's unsettling. I mean, it feeds into this whole narrative that he had these powerful connections that were protecting him even while he was incarcerated.
It definitely adds to the mystery.
And didn't he also face accusations of sexual assault while he was in prison?
There was an incident, where he was accused of raping a fellow inmate, but the charges were later dropped.
Of course they were.
It just adds another layer to his character, this ability to manipulate situations and evade consequences.
That's all so disturbing.
It really is.
But then years later, there was this diary that surfaced belonging to a man named Trevor Peters.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that.
And it really added a whole new dimension to the case, didn't it?
Absolutely. The entry in the diary described a chilling encounter between Peters and von Einem just days after Alan Barnes disappeared.
Oh, wow.
They were both at a hair salon, and Peters saw von Einem with these Polaroids, pictures of this young blonde man lying on the front seat of a car.
And what did he say when Peters asked him about the photos?
Von Einem just shrugged it off and said it was just some hitchhiker.
That sends shivers down my spine.
Especially knowing what we know now.
Absolutely. It just shows how callous he was.
The description of those photos was so graphic, that they've never been publicly released.
Oh, God.
And then there's the hairdresser, right?
Oh, yeah. Peters confronted the hairdresser years later.
And the hairdresser admitted to seeing photos of naked young men, often with objects inserted into their bodies.
That's just beyond disturbing.
I know. And to make things even creepier, the hairdresser died just days after that conversation.
Wow, talk about adding another layer of mystery.
It's like something out of a nightmare.
So with all these unanswered questions and these whispers of a cover-up, did the police ever make any more progress on the case?
In the late 2000s, there was a cold case review that focused on DNA evidence.
They must have been hoping that this new technology could provide the missing link, the evidence they needed to connect von Einem to the other murders.
Exactly. They were really hoping for a breakthrough.
And what were the results?
Unfortunately, the DNA testing didn't yield any conclusive results.
Man, that's so
It
frustrating.
was a major disappointment for everyone involved.
So where does that leave us?
Well, Bevan Spencer von Einem is still in prison, likely to die there.
But the families of his other suspected victims are still left with all these unanswered questions.
That's right. There's still no real closure for them.
Were there others involved? What happened to Peter Stognoff? Why has no one else ever been held accountable?
These are questions that continue to haunt this case even after all these years.
It's just heartbreaking to think about the pain and suffering those families have endured and the fact that they may never get the answers they deserve.
It's a reminder that even though justice may be served in some cases, there are still many victims who are left without closure.
Well, thank you for taking us through this deep dive. It's been a really heavy but important conversation. And for those listening, if you're interested in learning more about this case, I highly recommend checking out the Case File podcast episode that we mentioned, Case 166, The Family.
There are also some books and documentaries out there that go into even more detail.
The Family Murders is a case that will likely continue to fascinate and haunt us for years to come. It's a reminder that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, and that the search for truth and justice can be a long and winding road.
It's a case that raises a lot of important questions about the nature of evil, the limits of the justice system, and the importance of never giving up hope for answers.
Well said. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.